Liz Hartford's hands trembled slightly as she added another pinch of thyme to the beef stew, the spice falling between her fingers like sand through an hourglass. The kitchen clock read 7:15 p.m., its steady ticking a counterpoint to the rhythmic bubbling of the pot. She inhaled deeply, catching the rich aroma of bay leaves mingling with the earthy scent of root vegetables. The same recipe she'd perfected over 23 years of marriage. The sound of an engine cut through her concentration. Through the steam-fogged window, she watched Jackson's Ford F-150 pull into their driveway, the headlights cutting sharp beams through the falling snow. Her wooden spoon clattered against the stovetop as a second figure emerged from the passenger side. A woman, tall and blonde, her hair catching the porch light as Jackson helped her down from the truck with familiar tenderness. Liz's throat constricted. The gesture was so intimate, so careful, the way Jackson used to help her navigate icy surfaces in their early days together. She gripped the counter's edge, feeling the smooth granite beneath her fingers, anchoring herself to something, solid as her world began to tilt. The front door opened with a rush of February air, bringing with it the sharp scent of winter and expensive perfume. "Liz," Jackson called out, his voice carrying that forced lightness she'd grown to recognize. Over the past few months, each late night at the construction site, each missed dinner, each distracted conversation suddenly crystallized into perfect, terrible clarity. "We need to talk." The woman who followed him into the kitchen moved with the fluid confidence of youth, her designer boots clicking against the hardwood floors Liz and Jackson had installed together 10 summers ago. She couldn't be more than 37, a full 15 years younger than Liz's 52. "This is Cassidy," Jackson said, his hand settling on the small of the younger woman's back. The casual possessiveness of the gesture made bile rise in Liz's throat. "She's moving in today." Moving in? The words felt foreign on Liz's tongue, as if she were speaking a language she'd never learned. "What do you mean, moving in?" "It means exactly what it sounds like," Jackson replied, his voice hardening. He still wouldn't meet her eyes, instead focusing on a point just past her left shoulder. "Cassidy and I are together. I want you out by tonight." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the persistent bubbling of the stew and the mechanical heartbeat of the kitchen clock. Liz studied her husband's face, the face she'd woken up to for over 2 decades. The gray threading through his dark hair had appeared gradually, like rain seeping into soil. The lines around his mouth had deepened recently, and there was a yellowish tinge to his skin that he hadn't noticed yet. But she had. She'd noticed everything. "You can't just—" Liz began, but Jackson cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I can and I am. I've already talked to Larry at the bank. The house is in my name." His words fell like stones between them. "Pack what you need for tonight. You can come back for the rest later." Cassidy shifted her weight, examining her manicured nails with exaggerated interest. A diamond ring caught the kitchen light, and Liz recognized it instantly. The one Jackson had claimed was for his sister last month. The lie sat heavy in the air, another brick in the wall being built between them. Without speaking, Liz walked to her purse hanging by the door. She withdrew a manila envelope, the paper warm from being carried close to her body for the past day. "Your test results came back from Dr. Samuel yesterday," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You might want to read them." She climbed the stairs to their bedroom, his bedroom now, each step feeling like a mountain to scale. The familiar scent of their shared life surrounded her as she mechanically packed a small suitcase. Lavender detergent, the cedar blocks in the drawers, the lingering traces of Jackson's aftershave that she'd grown to love and now had to learn to forget. When she returned downstairs, Jackson sat at the kitchen table, the medical papers spread before him like a map to a future he hadn't planned. His face had lost all color, and even Cassidy's confident demeanor showed cracks, her perfectly lined eyes darting between them with growing uncertainty. Liz picked up her coat and car keys. The stew continued to simmer on the stove, filling the house with the scent of the life she was leaving behind. As she opened the front door, the bitter Montana wind stung her cheeks, mixing with the warm tracks of tears she hadn't realized she'd been crying. Virginia's diner stood like a beacon in the gathering darkness, its neon sign humming against the snow-heavy sky. Liz's Subaru left twin trails in the fresh powder as she pulled into the nearly empty lot. For 2 hours, She'd driven aimlessly through Montana Springs, watching familiar landmarks transform into strange monuments to her unraveling life. The hardware store where she and Jackson had bought their first tools together, the park where they'd walked every Sunday morning, the construction site where he'd built his company from the ground up. Each place now felt like a photograph from someone else's life. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, releasing a wave of coffee-scented warmth. Behind the counter, Mrs. Virginia looked up from her crossword puzzle, her weathered face creasing with concern as she took in Liz's red-rimmed eyes and hastily packed suitcase. "Oh, honey," the older woman said, already reaching for the coffee pot with one hand while adjusting her reading glasses with the other. The familiar clink of ceramic against metal as she prepared a fresh pot provided a momentary comfort. "Come sit down before you fall down." Liz slid into her usual booth, the one where she and Jackson had shared breakfast every Sunday for 2 decades. The vinyl seat squeaked beneath her, and her fingers automatically found the small tear in the upholstery she'd memorized over countless meals. Mrs. Virginia set down a steaming mug of coffee, the porcelain warm against Liz's cold hands, then slid into the seat across from her. "He's sick, Virginia," Liz whispered, watching the steam rise from her cup like prayers. "Stage 3 liver cancer. And he doesn't even know that I know. Didn't know until today." A laugh escaped, her hollow and sharp as broken glass. "I've spent the last 2 weeks trying to figure out how to tell him, and now?" She trailed off, the words sticking in her throat like unshed tears. Virginia reached across the table and squeezed Liz's hand. Her skin was soft with age, but strong from years of carrying plates and wiping tables. A strength built from a lifetime of witnessing other people's stories unfold in this very diner. "You're staying with me tonight. No arguments." Through the diner's windows, the forgotten Christmas lights still hanging along Main Street swayed in the winter wind, casting intermittent shadows across the snow-covered sidewalks. The colored lights reflected off the fresh snow, creating a kaleidoscope effect that made the familiar street seem dreamlike and distant. "I should have seen it coming," Liz continued, her voice barely audible above the soft country music playing from the diner's ancient jukebox. The song was one Jackson used to sing along to, back when they were young and everything seemed possible. The late nights at the construction site, the new cologne, the way he stopped looking at me during dinner. She paused, wrapping her fingers tighter around the warm mug. But I was so focused on those damn test results. Morning light filtered through Virginia's guest room window, the lace curtains casting intricate shadows on the faded floral wallpaper. Liz hadn't slept much, spending the night listening to the town's heartbeat, freight trains rumbling through at midnight, then 2 a.m., then 4, their whistles echoing off the mountains like distant whale songs. Each passing hour brought a new layer of reality to her situation, settling over her like the fresh snow outside. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, Dr. Samuel's name illuminating the screen for the 3rd time since dawn. With a deep breath, she answered. "Liz." His deep voice carried years of professional concern layered with personal friendship. "Word travels fast in small towns. Martha from the pharmacy called me last night." I told him about the diagnosis, she said, sitting up against the headboard, feeling the cool wood through her thin nightgown. "Well, gave him the papers anyway." The silence on the other end stretched like a taut wire. "I'm coming over to Virginia's. Give me 20 minutes. True to his word, Dr. Samuel arrived exactly 20 minutes later. His silver hair sparkled with melting snowflakes, and his medical bag hung from his shoulder despite this not being a professional visit. Virginia showed him up to the guest room, then disappeared downstairs, the smell of fresh coffee trailing in her wake. "I've been treating Jackson for 3 months, he said, settling into the room's only chair, a worn wingback that had witnessed countless conversations between Virginia and troubled souls seeking refuge. "He made me promise not to tell you, said he didn't want to burden you with it." He removed his glasses, cleaning them with the edge of his sweater, a nervous habit Liz had observed over 20 years of appointments. "I've known you both since you moved here. Keeping this secret, it hasn't sat right with me." Liz stood by the window, watching early morning traffic crawl along Main Street. Mr. Peterson was sweeping snow from the hardware store sidewalk, his movements precise and practiced after 30 years of the same routine. His wife appeared with 2 travel mugs of coffee, and they paused to talk, their breath visible in the cold air. "You know what the hardest part is?" she asked, not turning around. "I still love him. After everything, I still love him. And now he's going to face this with her instead of me." Her voice cracked on the last word, the sound sharp as breaking ice. Dr. Samuel stood, his chair creaking slightly. His hand on her shoulder felt warm and steady. "Cancer is a lonely road, Liz. Even with someone new by his side, he'll feel that loneliness. And Cassidy." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She doesn't know what she's signed up for. The late-night emergencies, the endless appointments, the way cancer becomes a third person in every conversation." Liz pressed her forehead against the cold window pane. Below, Mrs. Peterson was adjusting her husband's scarf, a simple gesture of care that brought fresh tears to her eyes. For 23 years, she'd straightened Jackson's tie every morning, smoothed his collar, made sure he remembered his lunch. How quickly ritual becomes memory. "What do I do now?" she whispered, more to herself than to Dr. Samuel. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street. In the distance, the mountains stood silent and strong, their peaks disappearing into the winter sky. Their permanence mocked her changing world, yet somehow offered comfort. They had witnessed countless stories like hers, and still stood unchanged. The sharp smell of bleach burned Cassidy's nostrils as she scrubbed at a stubborn stain on the bathroom floor. 2 weeks had passed since she'd moved into Jackson's house, and nothing, absolutely nothing, resembled the romantic future she'd imagined. The pristine granite countertops and modern appliances couldn't mask the lingering evidence of another woman's life. The slight wear pattern in front of the kitchen sink, the height marks of growing children penciled inside a closet door, the recipe cards in familiar handwriting she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Jackson's retching echoed from behind the closed door, the sound becoming all too familiar. Another round of chemotherapy, another morning of holding back his thinning hair while he vomited. She sat back on her heels, rubber gloves dripping with disinfectant, and fought back tears of frustration and guilt. "I'm fine," Jackson called out weakly, his voice muffled by the door. "Just give me a minute." But he wasn't fine. The doctor's appointments multiplied like rabbits on her calendar, each one bringing new medications, new side effects, new challenges. The strong, confident man who had swept her off her feet at the construction site, where she worked, as an architect designing their latest project, was fading away. His tool belt hung untouched by the garage door, collecting dust alongside his dreams of their future together. The doorbell's chime startled her from her thoughts. Through the front window, she recognized Martha from the church committee, clutching what appeared to be another casserole dish. The third this week. Each delivery came with poorly disguised judgment in the women's eyes, their whispered conversations stopping abruptly when they saw her. She'd learned to read their expressions, part pity, part contempt, all wrapped in small-town propriety. She pulled off the rubber gloves and smoothed her hair, preparing to face another round of polite condemnation. The diamond ring on her finger, the one that had seemed so promising just weeks ago, felt heavy now, like a shackle rather than a symbol of love. "Did you hear? She's barely managing." The whispers followed Liz through the aisles of Morton's grocery store like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. She kept her head high, pretending not to notice Mrs. Morton and her daughter huddled by the canned goods, their conversation dying as she passed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything look slightly unreal. "Morning, Liz," Tom Morton called out from behind the counter, his smile genuine beneath his salt and pepper mustache. He was one of the few people in Montana Springs who could still look her in the eye without that mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. "Those organic vegetables you ordered came in. Added some extra tomatoes. They looked too good to pass up." She thanked him, accepting the box of produce. The familiar weight in her arms gave her purpose. She'd started cooking meals for the local homeless shelter, turning her evenings into productive hours instead of empty spaces filled with memories. The routine of chopping, stirring, and serving provided structure to days that threatened to dissolve into formless grief. The cardboard box pressed against her hip as she pushed through the store's automatic doors, triggering a blast of warm air that smelled of artificial pine. As she loaded the groceries into her car, movement caught her eye. A man stood in front of the old Whitman building, carefully setting up an easel despite the brisk wind. His gray beard and paint-splattered jacket marked him as someone who existed outside Montana Springs. Careful social categories. "You're blocking my light," he said gruffly as she unconsciously drifted closer, drawn by the bold strokes of his brush. "Sorry," Liz replied, stepping aside. The movement revealed his canvas, where the building's decay was transforming into something unexpectedly beautiful. "I've just never seen anyone paint the Whitman building before. Most people pretend it doesn't exist," he grunted, mixing colors on his palette with practiced movements. "Elijah Green. And everything's worth painting if you look at it. Right. Even the broken things. Especially the broken things." The building's peeling paint and boarded windows became something else entirely on his canvas, a testament to endurance rather than neglect. Liz found herself standing there long after her frozen vegetables had begun to thaw, watching history and art merge beneath Elijah's careful hands. "You're holding that brush like it's going to bite you," Elijah commented 3 weeks later, watching Liz tentatively dab paint onto canvas in his studio. The converted warehouse space smelled of turpentine and possibility, its high windows filling the room with northern light that seemed to hold secrets in its shadows. "I haven't painted since high school," she admitted, frowning at her attempt to capture the sunset over the mountains. The colors kept mixing into muddy browns instead of the vibrant oranges and purples she saw in her mind. "Jackson always said art was a waste of time, said practical people focused on practical things." Elijah's brush paused mid-stroke, leaving a drop of cerulean blue suspended in air. "And what do you say?" The question echoed off the concrete floors and exposed beams. Through the studio's massive windows, she could see the hospital where Jackson was receiving his treatments. Sometimes, she caught glimpses of Cassidy's red Audi in the parking lot, its glossy surface out of place among the weathered pickup trucks and practical sedans. "I say," she started, then stopped, surprised by the thickness in her voice. Her hands trembled slightly as she cleaned her brush. "I say I've spent too many years letting someone else define what matters. I say I'm tired of being practical if practical means being numb." The studio fell quiet, except for the soft scratching of brushes against canvas and the distant whistle of a train crossing town. That sound had once meant counting the hours, until Jackson came home, explaining away his absences with late meetings and project deadlines. Now it was just another note in the symphony of her changing life. "You know," Elijah said, cleaning his brush with practiced movements that made the process look like a dance, "sometimes the hardest part of painting isn't learning the technique. It's learning to trust what you see, not what others tell. You're supposed to see, art isn't about perfection. It's about truth." Liz looked at her canvas, really looked at it. The mountains were wrong, the colors too bright, but there was something honest in its imperfection. Like her life now, messy, unfinished, but finally, authentically hers. She reached for a clean brush, ready to try again. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibration seeming to shake the entire room. Dr. Samuel's name appeared on the screen. "Jackson's asking for you. It's bad." Her brush clattered to the floor, leaving a splash of crimson on the concrete that looked too much like blood. The sound echoed through the studio like a gunshot, making both of them jump. "Go," Elijah said softly, already gathering her things. "Art will wait. Some things won't." Spring arrived in Montana Springs with the subtlety of a freight train, melting snow into muddy rivulets that carved paths down Main Street. The transition between seasons brought a raw honesty to the landscape, revealing everything winter had hidden beneath its white blanket. In the hospital's oncology ward, Jackson's room had become a timeline of his decline. Wilting flowers in various stages of decay, half-eaten meals on disposable trays, and the steady beep of monitors marking the passage of days. The institutional lighting cast a greenish pallor over everything, making even the cheerful get-well cards seem somehow sinister. The room smelled of antiseptic and illness, undercut by the artificial strawberry scent of the protein shakes. Jackson could barely keep down. "I can't do this anymore. Cassidy confessed to Liz in the hospital cafeteria, her designer clothes hanging loose on her frame like costumes from someone else's life. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed sleepless nights, and her perfectly manicured nails were bitten to the quick. I thought I was strong enough, but... Liz stirred her untouched coffee, watching the cream create spiral patterns that reminded her of the way life had of circling back on itself. The cafeteria buzzed with quiet conversations and the clinking of plastic utensils against plastic trays. A television mounted in the corner played soundless weather forecasts, promising spring storms. "Nobody's strong enough alone," she said finally, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. "That's why we have each other." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. 2 months ago, they'd been strangers, enemies even. Now they shared the exhausting routine of hospital visits, medication schedules, and the weight of loving a dying man in different ways. Their rivalry had dissolved in the face of something bigger than both of them. Through the cafeteria, window by, Liz could see Elijah setting up his easel in the hospital garden. He'd taken to painting there, his presence a quiet reminder that beauty could exist alongside pain. Today he was capturing the way early morning light caught the dew on newly sprouted daffodils, life persisting despite everything. "I'm sorry," Jackson whispered one evening, his voice barely audible over the humming machines. The words seemed to cost him tremendous effort, each syllable a battle against his failing strength. "I'm so damn sorry, Liz." She sat beside his bed in the chair that had molded to her shape after countless hours. The vinyl squeaked slightly as she leaned forward to adjust his blanket. Cassidy had gone home to shower and change, leaving them alone for the first time since that night in the kitchen that felt like a lifetime ago. The hospital room had grown familiar in its sterility. The rhythmic beeping of monitors, the gentle whoosh of the oxygen machine, the distant sounds of nurses, shoes squeaking on linoleum floors. Outside the window, the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, nature's daily reminder that beauty persisted even in the hardest moments. "I know," Liz replied, smoothing a wrinkle from his blanket. The gesture was automatic, born from decades of caring for this man who had both loved and betrayed her. His skin felt paper-thin beneath her touch, like autumn leaves ready to crumble. "I was scared," he continued, his yellowed eyes finding hers with unexpected clarity. The machines beeped in counterpoint to his labored breathing. "When I got the first diagnosis, I couldn't face it. Couldn't face you." Cassidy was an escape, Liz finished for him, her voice gentle. "I understand that now." And she did. Not enough to erase the pain, but enough to sit here, holding his hand as the spring sunset painted the hospital room in shades of forgiveness. Understanding didn't mean forgetting, but it meant finding peace in the spaces between what was and what could have been. Jackson passed away on a Tuesday morning, just as the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the hospital garden. The moment itself was quieter than Liz had expected. A gentle exhale, a slowing monitor, and then silence. She and Cassidy sat on either side of his bed, their shared vigil ending in a moment that felt both sudden and eternally long. The room filled with medical staff moving with practiced efficiency, their voices soft and professional. Through the window, Liz watched a hummingbird hover near the newly bloomed columbines, life continuing its dance even as death made its final bow. The funeral drew the entire town, their judgment softened by the universal language of grief. The church pews creaked under the weight of collective mourning. Mrs. Virginia organized an army of casserole-bearing women, their dishes filling the church basement with the scent of comfort food. Tom Morton closed his store early, the "closed for funeral" sign hanging crooked in his haste. Even Elijah came, standing at the back with paint-stained hands clutching a small canvas, a portrait of Jackson in his younger days, strong and smiling against a backdrop of Montana mountains, the yellows and blues capturing a vitality that cancer had stolen. After the service, as people filed out into the spring sunshine, Cassidy approached Liz. Her black dress was designer but rumpled, and her engagement ring was conspicuously absent. "What will you do now?" she asked, genuine curiosity replacing their former animosity. Liz looked across the cemetery to where Elijah was setting, up his easel, capturing the way light played on the fresh flowers and the ancient headstones. The scene before him was both an ending and a beginning, much like her own story. "Live?" she said simply. "Just live." 1 year later, the old Whitman building had transformed into the Montana Springs Art Center. The peeling paint and boarded windows had given way to restored brick and gleaming glass, much like how Liz's own life had undergone its renovation. She stood in the main gallery, surrounded by her first exhibition, a series of paintings chronicling her journey through loss, betrayal, and healing. Each canvas told a story. The kitchen clock frozen at 7:15, Virginia's diner glowing in the snow, hospital corridors softened by sunset light. The paintings spoke of pain but also of resilience, each brushstroke a testament to survival. Elijah moved among the guests, his critical eye softened by pride in his students' work. He'd become more than a teacher, a friend who had shown her how to see beauty in broken places. Cassidy had returned to Seattle, but sent a card congratulating Liz on the opening, her elegant handwriting expressing genuine good wishes. Dr. Samuel brought his wife, both of them beaming as they studied each painting, remembering the journey they'd witnessed. The final piece in the exhibition showed a woman standing alone on a mountain peak, her face turned toward the rising sun. The sky in the painting held all the colors of hope, pinks, golds, and the promise of blue. Below, the title card read, "Beginning Again." Mrs. Virginia appeared at Liz's side, pressing a cup of coffee into her hands, the same gesture she'd offered that first night when Liz's world had shattered. "You did good, honey," she said softly. "You did real good." Through the gallery's windows, Liz could see Main Street coming alive with morning traffic. Mr. Peterson was sweeping his sidewalk with the same careful attention he'd shown. For decades, the hardware store was opening its doors, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley. Life in Montana Springs continued, as it always had, but now she saw it through different eyes, eyes that had learned to find beauty in the broken places and strength in the starting over. The morning sun streamed through the gallery windows, catching the dust motes in its beam, making them dance like stars. Liz sipped her coffee and smiled, knowing that endings were just beginnings in disguise. What did you think of the story? Leave a comment and rate this story from 0 to 10. What rating would you give it and why? 2 buttons will appear next to it, one to subscribe if you haven't already, and the other to watch other interesting stories. Choose one. Thanks for watching this far. See you soon.